Hi, Maggie, how are you?
Hi, how are you doing?
Good, thanks. Perhaps we should start off just by introducing ourselves. I'm Jesse Bering, and I'm a psychologist on writing sabbatical, actually. Now I'm living in Columbus, Ohio, but I'm the director of the Institute of Cognition and Culture at the Queen's University of Belfast. And I also write a semi-weekly blog on Scientific American called Bering in Mind, and some other writing responsibilities, and Slate, and so on. And I study mostly human sexuality, so this is a very different topic for me here. But we're going to be talking a little bit about the situation in Japan. So we have you on, Maggie, as the resident expert. And you're Maggie Koerth, so tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, I am the science editor at Boing.net, and I don't like to say that I'm an expert.
Right.
I talk to experts, and then I kind of come back and tell people what the experts said. But I have been following the nuclear reactor situation in Japan for the last week. We're recording this on Friday, March 18th. And I have been talking to nuclear scientists and health physicists about what's happening and also the health effects of what's happening.
Okay, so maybe we should just start off getting an up-to-speed account of the situation in Japan, especially with respect to the nuclear reactors.
Yeah, so there are actually, so originally there were two nuclear power plants that were having problems, Fukushima Daiichi and Fukushima Daini, which basically just means Fukushima 1 and Fukushima 2. And everything seems to have gotten under control at Fukushima Daini, the last that I had heard. It's Daiichi that we are talking about right now, and there are several nuclear reactors at Daiichi. I believe that there are 4 of the reactors that have been having problems off and on over the past week. Today, my understanding is that they're just kind of continuing to try to get water into the reactors where the water level has fallen around the fuel rods. What they're trying to do right now is spray that from water cannons and from fire engine hoses. The way that is set up, though, they have to spray up and can't actually see what they're spraying into. So they're not entirely certain whether what they spray up gets in. And they suspect that it is, though, because they're seeing steam and they're seeing radiation levels go down as they spray up. So they're assuming that water is getting into where it needs to go. And then the other thing that's going on today is people trying to run a power connection to get actual water pumps back up online. And that, to my understanding, basically involves what you could really just describe as a really long extension cord. They're trying to run a power cable that I think, if I'm recalling correctly, it might be at least a mile long back to a place where the power is working.
Okay.
So that's what's going on right now.
So on a scale of sort of significance or danger of 1 to 10, where are we now?
I don't know that I can put it on a scale of 1 to 10, mainly because I'm not familiar enough with nuclear accidents to know that scale. But I do know that what I've been told is that this is something much more akin to 3 Mile Island in the United States than it is to Chernobyl. And 3 Mile Island, we have seen, what the health physicists tell me is that over the last 30 years since that accident happened, we've actually seen no related cancers pop up in the area around 3 Mile Island.
So that was my next question.
Yeah.
What, in terms of radioactive fallout and the health effects, both in the immediate vicinity and then the surrounding areas, I mean, what type of problems would we expect to encounter?
Well, there are 2 things that radiation can cause, basically 2 effects you're looking at. One of those is radiation sickness, and that's where you see like the photos from Chernobyl of people whose hair has fallen out or who are dying in really horrible ways. That's radiation sickness. And that only happens if you are exposed to very high doses. The only people in Japan that are at risk of radiation sickness right now, to my understanding, are the ones working inside the Fukushima plant to try to cool down the reactors. The other thing that radiation exposure can cause is an increased risk in your lifetime, or an increase in your lifetime risk of cancer. And that's not a given that you will get cancer. It's a, your risk goes up. So, for instance, what a health physicist at the Mayo Clinic told me is that the average American, and this is like combining males, females, not really adding anything, taking anything out to make the demographics tighter, the average American has a 42% risk of cancer over the course of his or her entire lifetime. And
is there a particular type of cancer that we would be vulnerable to with radiation exposure?
It depends on what specific radioisotopes you're talking about. So, for instance, the two that are particularly problematic in situations like this because they have a tendency to travel long distances and they're the ones that health physicists are particularly worried about are a radioactive isotope of iodine, which is most likely to cause thyroid cancer, and a radioisotope of cesium, which is most likely to cause bone cancer.
I see.
So it really depends on what you're exposed to.
And I mean, my original training was in developmental psychology, so I'm actually trying to think about sort of teratogen exposure during embryological development and how this might affect pregnant women, for example. Do we know anything about that in particular?
One of the really interesting things that I found out is that up until Chernobyl, there was a lot of expectation that exposure to radioactivity by people who were pregnant or by people who then later became pregnant might lead to mutations and physical defects in their offspring. But one of the things that they've seen from Chernobyl is that that's not happened. Even people who were exposed to extremely high levels of radiation at Chernobyl went on to have children who were not affected. So what the health physicists tell me is that this is the situation where we have all this data from animal studies and from fruit fly tests, but what we saw in the animals isn't playing out in people, or at least it hasn't in the situations where that's been where that exposure has happened. The same thing with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. No one had deformed children after Hiroshima and Nagasaki either.
Oh, okay. That's actually surprising. I was under the impression for some reason that the Chernobyl, a lot of the women who were pregnant during the Chernobyl disaster actually did have mutated children. So that's not true? Is that a sort of...
That's, from what I am understanding, that's not true. And I have asked people specifically about that, and they said that did not happen. There might have been miscarriages, and I know that there were situations where people were getting cancers that cause deformations, so like leukemia and bone cancers and thyroid cancers, which would cause large lumps on the side of your neck. And some of those photos of children affected by fast-growing bone cancers and things like that were kind of disseminated around and got misinterpreted as mutations. Okay,
so they were not some sort of prenatal exposure to the radiation.
That's my understanding. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's. I mean, I don't know if that's encouraging, but it's.
It's hard to say.
It gives us a clearer picture about the actual threats that we're dealing with here. And how far, in terms of the vicinity and the surrounding areas, that would people need to be concerned about radiation exposure?
So, radiation exposure, the radiation risk is really a factor of dose and plus time. And the dose gets lower the further you get away from it because the radioactive isotopes are pretty much diluted by the wind. They spread apart and then you're not exposed to as high of a concentration, which means your dose is lower.
So I've heard some stories like in passing about some radiation clouds essentially somehow making their way to the continental U.S. Is that an exaggeration or is that?
So that is both true and not true. It's true in that we are likely to have detectable levels of radiation that reach the U.S. West Coast, but we can detect radiation at levels much, much lower then really cause problems for human health. The levels of radiation that they're expecting to reach the U.S. West Coast are levels where exposure, when populations are exposed to those levels, we can't actually find any evidence of an increased risk of cancer. That doesn't mean that there's no health effects, but it means that we have no way of actually seeing the health effects. They're that small. So it's really, there's nothing for Americans to worry about at all. One of the things that the Union of Concerned Scientists has actually said this week is that people in the U.S. and in Europe actually should stop buying potassium iodide pills, because there are people in Japan that actually need those and there's a limited supply, and if we're hoarding them here when we don't need them, that's fewer that can't get to Japan.
Okay, that's important to know, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess, kind of going back to, beyond the sort of the nuclear reactor situation, just the mechanics of the disaster itself and what's actually happened, for people like me that are completely naive in the sense of geophysics and how these types of things actually work. One of the things that struck me, you wrote an article about just sort of the mechanics of earthquakes and, for example, what determines the size of a tsunami wave, and the factors that go into actually calculating that, and how precise a formula we actually can develop in prediction. One of the things that I had a question about is the sort of the receding of the tsunami wave. I mean, we have all seen these horrific images of the tsunami wave actually going into these areas. But how long does it take for it to go back?
I don't actually know the answer to that question. That's something really interesting that I should look into some more. I've been mostly focused on the nuclear crisis all this week, but I'm hoping to do some more stories kind of after this stuff calms down a little bit on some of the earthquake science, because there is some really interesting stuff going on there. And I honestly don't know. I know that in several of the cities in Japan, they had not just one tsunami wave, but several. That the tsunami waves came in, receded, and then another one would come in. But I don't know how long.
Yeah, in other words, there's some sort of science that actually can help us to determine the interim between tsunami waves, and because it seems, I mean, at least in just sort of looking at the images, that it receded fairly quickly. I mean, it came in and it was devastating, but within a relatively short period of time, it wasn't there anymore. The water wasn't there anymore. So I'm just kind of wondering how that actually works.
It is kind of interesting, and one of the things that that's come up that I guess I didn't realize. I've lived in landlocked places my entire life, but it's interesting to know that in these coastal cities of Japan, they have tsunami drills the way that we have tornado drills in the Midwest. Kids are trained to hop up in the middle of class and take off running for high ground, and they have places that people can go for that kind of thing.
And speaking of that, I was thinking about the sort of the precautions that one can take, especially in terms of like urban planning and development. And you were speaking to one expert in an article. I can't remember who it was, but I think it was a geophysicist working in California, talking about, with earthquakes at least, how areas neighborhoods that were built on bedrock were more stable in terms of the potential for disaster than those that were built on alluvial soil. So in areas that are particularly vulnerable, why aren't more neighborhoods built on solid bedrock foundations? I mean, is there just sort of
there's only so much bedrock to go around. And I'm not familiar with the topography of like a specific place in California, but I know that like if you look at a cutaway of New York City, for instance, most of it is alluvial soil, but you'll see like these sheets of bedrock that kind of come up and come back down. So the Empire State Building sits by itself without a whole lot of other skyscrapers around it, because that's the one spot in that area where bedrock shoots up, and so they could have a really good foundation for that skyscraper at the time. So it's partly an issue of
it probably wouldn't be easy to have some sort of like artificial bedrock.
Unfortunately, there's not. Unfortunately, there's not. But there are other sorts of precautions that people take. For instance, I'm sure that like all of Tokyo isn't sitting on bedrock, but you saw those videos of the skyscrapers, they're made to move.
Right.
So they're sitting on little, almost like on casters to a certain extent, that sort of just sway with the movements of the Earth, so that when there is an earthquake, they don't crumble, they just move.
Right, so I mean the architects there, I'm sure, are working with all sorts of computer simulation models with the degree by which the buildings would move and so on. With tsunamis, the precautions, I would imagine, are a little bit more difficult.
Japan builds
architecturally, there's
walls.
only so much you can do in terms of protecting yourself from a tsunami wave.
Right.
But
I know that there's a town in Oregon that's actually trying to build on the Oregon coast, that's actually trying to build a new city hall that would be on raised concrete piers, with the idea that it could be a place where anybody on the street could go if there was a tsunami coming and be in someplace safer.
Mm-hmm. I see. Well, that's all incredibly interesting, and I'm wondering how it's going to play out over the next couple of weeks or so. Whether does it seem like we've seen the worst of it at this point, or is the big sort of unknown factor the nuclear?
The big unknown factor is the nuclear situation, and it's hard to say how long that will take to come to some kind of conclusion. The thing is that the longer that they're able to, the longer you can actually the reactors have been shut down already. So there are no new nuclear reactions happening. What we're seeing is the heat and the radioactive particles from those previous reactions that just don't dissipate away immediately. It takes time. So what people told me earlier last week is that the longer they can keep things cool, the better things get as time goes on. But it may be weeks before we're able to really know an outcome in this.
You did say in an article and in your discussion with Brian Shiro, that's his name, that the first thing that came to your mind was whether there was a connection between what happened in Japan and the earthquake in Christchurch. And what can you explain sort of the connection there? If there is any connection, or is that? It sounded like they are sort of beginning to take that possibility seriously, that there's a common denominator in some sense in terms of neighboring earthquakes. Not geographically, but neighboring in time.
Right. Yeah. Well, not necessarily in time. It is actually about geography. What he told me is that 5 years ago that would have been just a silly question, but they are starting to realize that when you have different fault lines that are connected to one another, as you do around the Pacific Rim, which is really more like baseball stitching. So like all these different faults that happen to be part of a chain of faults. Releasing pressure in one fault, having a movement there, can cause a fault in another area to have just enough buildup of pressure that it too then ruptures later. So
there's these subduction zones that you talk about,
right?
Which is what exactly?
Basically, that's a point where the Pacific plate. So we're talking about the crust of the Earth as it is broken into little chunks, moving around the molten underlayer, where the crust of the Pacific plate is sliding underneath of the crust of other plates next to it. So that's a subduction zone. And as these things move together, they can get kind of stuck, and pressure builds up, and eventually slips by. And what we see as an earthquake is that release of pressure and the movement happening all at once. So, several decades or several hundred years of pressure building up, released all at once.
So there are more subduction zones in this Pacific Rim area than there are in other areas?
Yes. Yeah. And then that's why we see so many earthquakes in that region.
Okay.
So we'll hopefully be able to reach some kind of conclusions sometime soon. But it's just one of those things that there's no fast anything at this point.
Right. It's certainly very scary. seeing the images, and obviously, of course, even more so, actually being there and seeing the tsunami wave coming at you, and how people actually process that information and begin to think about why this is happening.
Oh yeah. Well, actually, one thing that I read this week that it wasn't my own reporting, but Charles Q. Choi, who does a lot of work for Life Science, he's actually coincidentally in Chernobyl this week, and had been talking to health physicists there that are starting to think that there were more negative health impacts from caused by stress and caused by depression related to the Chernobyl incident than there were by radiation. So
just the sort of the lack of control and the unpredictability of the
and the fear, and then people who knew that they had been exposed to radiation and just assumed, well, my entire life is over, and became alcoholic, and just had these lifelong problems that weren't necessarily caused by radiation, but were caused by what they believed about their situation.
Sort of a dividing line between before and after.
Which kind of leads into your stuff. I mean, you study belief and the power of belief and how what we
I mean, one of the things that's sort of been interesting and cropping up is I think it was the mayor of Tokyo that was saying something along the lines of this being some sort of divine retribution of Japan's selfishness and egocentricness. And so I think that we do find those, and these are increasingly appearing, these sort of supernatural interpretations of these natural disasters. And that's very common. I mean, it's very, very much expected from a psychological perspective. But the interesting thing is that it's not. So I think, the common sense stance is that once we have a scientific understanding of the way that these things work, like you've just been describing in terms of tectonic plates shifting and so on, we can eliminate our appeal to supernatural agency. But that's not necessarily the case. I mean, there's, there are lots of people that are both scientifically minded, but also appeal to some sort of supernatural explanation simultaneously. So it's not an either-or situation. That's what we're beginning to learn through the psychological science of religion. So it's not a get out of the gaps necessarily. We can reject our supernatural intuitions, but you can certainly have those operating alongside scientific explanations, and they have in this case and in many others.
Well, one of the things that I kind of was wondering is, you're talking about it doesn't necessarily have to play out as religion. I'm curious about your perspective on conspiracy theories, because it seems to me that it's almost a secular way that instinct gets played out. I know I've had some of these articles that we've posted in the past couple of weeks talking about the science of, radiation safety, and there's usually always one or two people that are like, well, I just don't believe this. I'm kind of curious about that.
Schizophrenics are especially prone to these sort of conspiracy theories, and schizophrenia work. The interesting thing is that what this requires to see some sort of conspiracy theory or to see some sort of supernatural influence over these types of events is the over-attribution of intentionality, seeing minds and mental states where none in fact exist. Part of my research originally was on studying chimpanzees and human beings and comparing the similarities and the differences. And what seemed to be a huge difference, if not in degree, but perhaps just sort of categorically, is the ability to think about mental states. We are natural psychologists. We're constantly seeing minds operating behind the scenes. So whether it's the mind of God doing this to give us a message or communicating with us, or it's some sort of government conspiracy, all these people sort of operating behind the scenes, trying to trick us and deceive us, this requires this fundamental capacity to see minds. Unfortunately, in some cases, it's overextended, and it's extended to places where it doesn't properly belong.
Yeah, the minds thing was really fascinating to me, because I know you talked a little bit about the concept of theory of mind, which, as I understand it, is, when you start realizing that your internal monologue is not everybody's internal monologue, that there are other minds out there and they're thinking different things. And I kind of remember being like maybe 4 or 5 years old and sitting in the car on a ride with my mom and suddenly having this realization that, what I was thinking was not what everybody else was thinking.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of curious if there's, is there an age where this kicks in?
Well, your experience actually matches quite well with what we know about the development of theory of mind, that before the age of about 4 or so, children basically have a very egocentric perspective and tend to think that other people know what they know, for example. It's not that they look at other people and don't look at those people as having psychological states, but they don't understand that there can be differences of perspective, differences of opinion, and different beliefs, and knowledge, and ignorance, and those types of things. So it is about the age of 4. We know that through extensive research now, developmental research, that this theory of mind capacity begins to emerge. But you were probably a little bit more precocious than me in actually reflecting on this in any sort of significant sense. I mean, I remember being maybe 10 or so, and then looking around me and just having the conviction that maybe I have the only mind that actually exists. Maybe all the people around me are just some sort of hallucinations or robots, or and that's basically in philosophical terms that's called solipsism, to think that other people don't have mental states where you are the only subjective entity in the world. It's quite narcissistic, really. I didn't really believe that, but it was striking to me that that had never occurred to me before, that I didn't actually have proof that other people had minds, because you can't literally see a mind. All you can see is somebody else's body moving about in different ways, their faces contorting, and so on. So when this flares up most of the time, and this is why I think it helps to understand why this happens in the wake of tragedies and natural disasters, is when our violations are expected, when things go not according to plans. So in the everyday sort of social world, when people violate our expectations, when they do things that we're not expecting, that's where we really become ravenous for meaning. So I don't know, if you're walking down the street and somebody stops you and asks what time it is. Or actually, you ask them what time it is, and they tell you something like, I think it's supposed to rain tomorrow, or I'd like a whiskey sour, or something like that, something totally unrelated to what you just asked them. Because it doesn't fit with the sort of the behavioral model that you're predicting, you begin to try to get inside of their head. Maybe this person is crazy, maybe they didn't hear you, maybe they're just being sarcastic, whatever. You're taking a theoretical perspective about why they're reacting or behaving the way that they are. Jerome Bruner, who's a developmental psychologist, has this term called conversational implicatures, when people don't respond according to the sort of natural model of conversation. That's when you search for meaning. And I think something happens quite similarly when we deal with unexpected tragedies and heartache and misfortunes. We have the sense that things are going to go as planned, but when all of a sudden there's a tsunami and an earthquake, things like that, it shocks us. We didn't anticipate it, we didn't expect it, and that's when people really try to get inside of God's mind. And the interesting thing is that this is so easily connected with morality. That's when it really flares up. It seems to be about something that we've done in the past. We don't have to believe that necessarily, but that's the intuition, that's the sort of the natural stance. We can reject that intuition, but cross-culturally, that is a universal phenomenon.
Does that change at all? Because you talked about like the fact that children develop this theory of mind, and they kind of, it seems like it sort of progresses as you get older a little bit. So does our understanding of religion and our understanding of how we respond to these kind of cognitive different moments, somebody responding in that, would you like an ice cream cone? Yes, I'll have fish. Do children respond to that differently than adults?
Well, there's definitely there's a developmental sequelae in terms of our ability to understand all the sort of the complexities of social cognition. A 4-year-old will basically have a basic understanding that people have different beliefs and knowledge than they do. They could take that sort of first-order perspective and reasoning about other minds. But the real sort of Machiavellian complexities, where you're dealing with like different orders of mental state recursiveness, like he knows that she knows that I know that she knows, those types of things. There is a clear developmental pattern to that. It's not until the age of about 7 to 9 that children begin to really understand these sort of complex soap opera type of knowledge-based scenarios. And interestingly enough, that does connect to how we understand and how we reason about natural events, seeing signs in natural events. So
Mm-hmm.
my last article in Scientific American was precisely about this, that before the age of about 7 or so, children can understand God as basically an entity that does things because he or she or whatever it is wants to do things. Sort of like just a, kind of a poltergeist running around doing things at random. Does things intentionally. But it's not until the age of about 7 or so that children begin to conceptualize supernatural agents, like ghosts or like God, as actually giving them a message, something about what they don't know. And theoretically, the argument is that to think in that fashion, that natural events happen because they're signs or communicative messages, requires the ability for the child or the individual to take a third-person perspective, to look at God as thinking, God is telling me this because God knows that I don't know. So to be superstitious requires some degree of cognitive sophistication. It's not, superstition is not that clear-cut as being sort of just a childish, sloppy mode of thinking. In fact, it's a developmental accomplishment.
Interesting. That's really interesting. Because, I got the impression from reading a little bit about your book description that the belief instinct is something that made us successful as a species.
You mean this book? I'm showing it on the screen.
Yeah. Yeah, that book, yes. And I'm really curious about this because I come from, my degree is in anthropology, and I've always kind of gotten the impression that there is, this connection of religion as being when we started being able to apply the behaviors that we normally reserve for the tribe outside the tribe. Is that part of why the belief instinct has made us successful? Why it's not necessarily this silly childish thing?
Not sure exactly what you mean with applying it outside the tribe.
Well, concern for individuals within the tribe being different from concern for individuals outside the tribe, and that religion allowed you to expand what your definition of tribe was. So instead of just your immediate family or your extended family, now you could say, well, that family over there, they're part of the same religion that we are. They're technically part of our family. We should take care of them the same way that we take care of our family.
There's a lot of interesting work in that area. I mean, there are group selectionist models of religion, like David Sloan Wilson, for example, has a very nice perspective on that. My approach is complementary to that in the sense that it's sort of at a different level of analysis. But from an evolutionary perspective, my argument is that having the impression or suffering the illusion that misfortunes are about our social or moral behaviors basically helps us to inhibit antisocial behaviors that would ultimately harm our own self-interest, our reputations. And bad reputations typically tend to translate, all else being equal, into poor reproductive prospects or genetic fitness success. And we know through psychology experiments that feeling like you're being observed and feeling like you're being watched contributes to you inhibiting some selfish or impulsive or prepotent response. If you think you can get away with something and you do it, but in fact you're actually being watched by another human being, which is all that really matters in the natural world, you're going to get caught and your reproductive prospects are going to suffer. So being under the impression that there's a supernatural agent, however vague that supernatural agent is, even if it's something like karma, something concerned about your social behavior, helps us to sort of curb our impulsive decision making.
So that kind of fear of God as, keeping calm is almost enough to make you behave better?
Yeah, and there's empirical support demonstrating that.
Huh.
If you, we just published a study showing that if you put children in a room and you tell them that there's an invisible woman in the room, and you compare them to a control group that hears nothing about this invisible woman, and you leave them alone, we've got the hidden camera on them, we give them an opportunity to cheat at a highly tempting task. Those children who actually believe that she's in the room, and we assess independently sort of their belief in her, are significantly less likely to violate the rules when we leave them alone. And we know with adult studies too. I did a study while I was at the University of Arkansas where we told these undergraduate students that there was a ghost. We just sort of casually mentioned that a ghost had been seen in the room before, and then we left them alone and gave them an opportunity to cheat.
Do you just torture children for fun?
I do, yes. We of course debrief them and tell them that there's no such thing as this woman and so on afterward. But these are really methodologically, these are the only way to address these types of questions. So we do know that simply believing and having a conviction that you're being observed and watched by some supernatural agent does help to control social behavior. And at the level of the individual's reproductive success, the reason that would work is because you're basically protecting yourself from yourself, because there's always the possibility that you're going to underestimate the threat or the possibility of actual detection by other people.
Well, the other part of your book that I have noticed from the description is that you seem to think that that tool that has been useful to us in the past might not be as useful in the future. And I'm kind of curious about why you think that, because it sounds like this is something that is still applicable.
Well, it's the same. It's along these same lines because it still functions very much. This is the way that our brains have evolved. That we are especially sensitive to the illusion that there's some sort of morally concerned other that is involved in our autobiographies, that things happen for a reason and so on. It sort of creates this very vague. You don't have to be religious to have this sense. It typically manifests as religion, but even atheists, we know, occasionally sort of lapse into these teleological explanations that things happen for a reason, and it's hard not to see that sometimes. You can reject that sense or that experience, but it still is there. But anyway, the fact is that technological innovations have basically, to some extent, supplanted God. We've got hidden cameras now. We've got DNA analyses, we've got metal detectors, we've got handwriting tests, we've got all sorts of things that basically are designed to keep individual social behavior grounded, to protect not just the individual from other members of the society, but ultimately this helps us to protect us from ourselves too. You'd be a pretty stupid bank robber to go into a bank and not wear a disguise or something like that, because there are hidden cameras now to do that. So. Right. In the past, we might not have engaged in those types of activities because we were concerned that we were going to be punished somehow supernaturally. And in fact, that could happen. That does happen in a lot of cases still now. But technology serves much the same role that God does. So increasingly, the more that government is sort of evaluating and planting, social control regulation devices in society. God is not needed as much. The problem, of course, is that technological evolution advances much more swiftly than brain evolution. So the cognitive illusions of seeing a mind that's not there is still very much in place.
What I'm kind of curious, though, about, talking about the future. I know on Boing a lot, we talk about the dangers to personal freedom that some of these, substitute gods pose. How does that work into? I guess I'm kind of asking you to speculate on whether one is better than the other. Are we better off with a god that some of us think is imaginary, or are we better off with most people not necessarily needing God but having?
Yeah, I think I'm an atheist, but I take a fairly pessimistic view of the possibility that God will ever really go away. Because these cognitive illusions are so potent and so seductive and so emotionally appealing that most people will trust their gut. There's sort of the sense that there's a God, or that there are gods, that some sort of supernatural agents, and that their social behavior, their moral behavior actually matters in a domain that's more than just human. So first of all, I don't think that God is ever really going to go away. So I don't think that's really much of a practical problem that we're going to be dealing with. But having said that, we also don't need God to be good. You can, like I said, you can reject these sensations or these experiences of meaning or purpose and so on, and being judged and evaluated because we've still got all these other socially evolved mechanisms like shame and guilt and theory of mind, which allows us to take the perspective of other people and to understand that others will suffer as a consequence of our antisocial behavior, unless you're a psychopath or something like that. So, I mean, we've got all these other guardrails that operate alongside the illusion of supernatural agency that are just as effective. It's just that God is basically an additional safeguard to protect us.
So you don't necessarily need God or hidden cameras to be good. You can think about it sort of meta and realize, use that theory of mind aspect as well.
But having said that, the threat of punishment is a very effective, and we know this through behavioral economic studies. The threat of punishment is a very effective and powerful behavioral motivator. There are individual differences in empathetic capacities and feeling of shame and those types of things, but nobody wants to be punished because punishment is aversive.
Yeah,
So.
That makes sense. That covers a lot of what I had wanted to talk to you about.
And I'm actually just looking at my battery's about to die here, so too.
Oh, well, then we should probably
good timing.
Probably let you go.
But I think we covered a lot of ground, I think. And
it's interesting to kind of put some of this stuff into perspective with the cognitive aspects of it as well. Yeah.
The cognitive and the geophysical aspect too, which is what I wanted to talk about. And you definitely helped me understand that better. So I appreciate it. It's very nice chatting with you and meeting you.
Nice chatting with you and meeting you as well.
Okay, talk soon, Maggie.
Yeah, absolutely. Have a good day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.